Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Becoming a Balanced Christian podcast. I am Brian Davis, pastor of Restoring Love Baptist Church here in Mesa, Arizona. If you've been with us for any length of time, you know that we go over how to become a balanced Christian, how to escape the extremes of Christianity and walk in a spirit-led relationship with Christ through the Holy Spirit. Last week, we went over the inerrancy of Scripture and how it applied to biblical authority. And the week before that, we went over inerrancy as well, but focused more on the philosophical side of it. This week, I'm going to discuss the nature of truth, definition of truth, and how to apply truth to your life. I'm going to have David Catt back on. He'll help us glean and understand some great insights from this discussion. And this is vital because people have no idea what truth is anymore. They go around in a very unrational and unreasonable way of life. So this is a vital discussion. So let's go ahead and get started. Season 1, Episode 5 of the Becoming a Balanced Christian podcast starts now. It is Monday, October 11th, 2021. As I said, we're going to be going over what is truth and how to apply that truth to your life. And guys, I'm serious. You would be shocked at how many wild and wacky definitions there are for truth, but there's only one. And it's vital that we understand this because you can't live a consistent life without it, and you certainly can't believe in or serve God. So let's go ahead and get David Catt on, and we're going to dig into this, and I hope that it will be a blessing and an enlightenment to you. So give me just a second to pull him up on the screen here. How you doing, David?
Always an adventure, my friend.
Like always, brother, I get it. Well, as I told the viewers, we had another nice long talk last night, didn't we?
Yeah, that seems to be our MO. We've had a lot of those over the years.
Yeah, and then that nice long talk kind of transformed into this interesting text session after the fact, where we kind of elaborated even more on the things that we wanted to talk about. And this is going to be a fun discussion because the definition and nature of truth, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is something that is absolutely, well, decimated, butchered, and without definition today. No one knows what truth is.
Right, and the traditional definitions of truth have been rejected so many times in so many ways, and we're going to talk about a few of those ways later in the podcast.
Exactly. But here's the thing that we have to try to get figured out, I believe, first and foremost, is there are about, what do we have here? Well, there's many different views of what truth is. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them written down. 7 if you count the biblical definition. But I think
kind of 8 if you count the subpoint under hedonism.
Yeah, pretty much. So I think that we need to start with the biblical definition and defend the biblical definition. Then we'll move on to some of these false views. How's that sound?
Before we do that, I remember we had talked and I wanted to make a clarification on a previous podcast.
Yeah, go ahead and do that.
Okay. Hopefully you folks remember when we talked a few weeks ago about church attendance and the correct motivations because of that. You know, the correct motivations behind church attendance. Since we're talking about truth here, I wanted to clarify, make sure the church that you are attending is preaching true doctrine. Don't just attend a church because it's where your family has gone forever, or you don't have anywhere else to go. You know, it's a bad thing to sit under false doctrine. Even if that means that you aren't physically attending anywhere. Now, I'm not a huge proponent of the virtual church services. I think if you can be physically in a congregation worshiping, you should be. But, you know, there are times when you're like, look, there's no Bible-believing solid church near me that I can go to on a regular basis. I'll just maybe find something online until I can find, you know, something, you know, where I can go in person. You know, always be on the lookout for somewhere to attend, but don't sacrifice truth in order to physically attend a church.
And that's a very good point. And we're going to get into why that's important here later on in this episode, because truth is something that's not fluid. Truth is absolute. It's set in stone. Either something's right or wrong. They call that an antithesis of truth. You know, if something's true, that means the opposite is false.
Right.
And if that is the case, then if you are going to a church that is not preaching what is really true, then what it's preaching is false and thereby dangerous.
Oh, I agree entirely.
So with that in mind, we're going to use that kind of as a springboard into our discussion of truth here. Because as I said, we have about 8 different views of truth written down here, one of which is biblical and trustworthy and non-arbitrary. The rest of them are pretty much just derived from the utter imagination and arbitrary reason of man.
Yeah, there are various ways to reject truth.
And one thing that I'm wanting to bring out with that, well, before I bring that out, go ahead and give the dictionary definition of truth, and then I'm going to give a more layman's term. So
Okay.
Go ahead and give the dictionary definition, explain that, and then I'm going to explain it how I was taught in layman's terms.
Right. Now, I've prepared 3 different definitions, so it'll take me just a moment. Now, according to the Reader's Digest Great Encyclopedic Dictionary, truth is defined as 1, meaning the first definition. You know how they give you multiple numbered definitions. 1, the state or character of being true in relation to being, knowledge, or speech. Well, that's kind of a word salad, so let's move on to 2. Conforming to fact or reality. All right, that's pretty clear. Let's go on. 3, conformity to rule, standard, model, pattern, or ideal. All right, that's a little vague, but let's go on. 4, conformity to the requirements of one's being or nature, also known as steadfastness or sincerity. Okay, doesn't really apply necessarily to our discussion today. 5, that which is true, a statement or belief that corresponds to the reality. 6, a fact as the object of correct belief, also known as reality. Now, that's the definition of truth. I went one step further and looked up the word true to give it a little more depth. True is defined as 1, faithful to fact or reality, not false or erroneous, like we would say a true story. 2, being real or natural, genuine, not counterfeit. 3, genuine, not counterfeit. There we go. And those are the ones that kind of apply to our discussion today. Now, many people out there are probably saying, well, David, I don't have a copy of the Reader's Digest Great Encyclopedic Dictionary. Well, you probably don't. Mine is from 1975. So let's look at a more modern definition. I looked up dictionary.com. I have their app on my phone. Yes, I'm that much of a nerd. Truth is defined in the following ways according to dictionary.com. 1. The true or actual state of a matter. 2. Conformity with fact or reality. 3. A verified or indisputable fact, proposition, principle, or the like. 4. The state or character of being true. 5. Actuality or actual existence. 6. An obvious or accepted fact. 7. And this one really made me think. Ideal or fundamental reality apart from and transcending perceived experience.
All right, David, and I think those two definitions are good. I don't think we even need to go to the third one because those two definitions actually covered the layman's terms that I was wanting to give.
Oh, okay.
Because that was good because in layman's terms, how I was taught in school and from philosophy class and stuff like that, biblical truth as defined in the Bible can be as easily defined as anything that corresponds to reality. In other words, it's what is real, actual, or exists.
Yep.
That is what truth is. It's something that is objective. It's something that you can that you can put your finger on, that you can understand, that is actually out there in reality somewhere.
Right. Yep.
But here's the thing. Truth has to have a couple of characteristics about it in order for it to be true. Number one, since it's objective, it's got to be evidence-based. As I said, if it corresponds with reality, there has to be something in reality that it corresponds to. Some sort of evidence out there.
Okay, yep. I would like to define the word objective really quick.
Okay, go ahead.
Now I looked it up, and it's objective is not influenced by personal feelings, interpretations, or prejudice. There are so many things that can cloud what we think about something.
But it's impossible to be completely objective.
It is, but we should always strive to be as objective as possible when determining what is and is not true.
Yes, and that's true because no matter, but still remember, that is a secular definition, and I agree with you, but that's a secular definition. We have to remember, as we've said before, that all we have is evidence, and we have to interpret that evidence by presuppositions and a worldview, which by its very definition is a bias. So
right.
we have to be careful with that because people like to say that they are neutral and they approach evidence without any biases, but that's hogwash. It's impossible. Yeah. You can't be neutral.
Yeah, everybody's biased in some way. I think it's important that when we're thinking about truth and trying to decide what is and is not true, we need to say, okay, this is how I'm interpreting this. Why?
Exactly. You have to have evidence for it. It's got to be trustworthy. What you are believing has to be trustworthy. And it's got to be objective. It's got to have evidence backing it up. Nothing out there can outright refute it. Meaning, and what I mean by outright refute it is refuting it and proving it wrong with no reconciliation. There's no bouncing back, something that's definite. Because if there's a different way of interpreting or looking at something that aligns to reality, or you can interpret the evidence differently, then you're bringing in a different presupposition, which might be better than the one that originally said the truth claim was false.
Potentially.
And that happens all the time, especially in science. A Christian is going to interpret science a lot different than a secularist, and our presuppositions prove a lot of the secularists wrong. And it's because we approach it from a different angle.
Right. And that it's one of those where if we're truly honest about what the facts are saying, that will help guide us to figuring out, okay, this is true, this is false. And that's, I guess, what we mean when we say being objective.
Yeah, but there's one last thing I'm wanting to bring out, and this is probably the most important. Your truth claim has to be consistent. You have to be able to live in it consistently. Because all too often what happens is if your view of truth is wrong, it might look good in theory, but you cannot live it out in practice. And we will see that in every one of these false views that, oh, it looks good on paper, but no one who holds to these views can live by their presuppositions, by their view of truth consistently. They always go back to the biblical method of truth in some way.
Right. And I know this is kind of tangential, but it reminds me of, you ever operate a piece of machinery and you say to yourself, okay, there's no way in the world that the person that designed this piece of machinery has ever actually operated one of these, because otherwise they wouldn't have it doing it this way?
Yeah.
That's kind of what I think about with what you just said about being able to live in your truth. There are a lot of things that look good on paper and, oh man, that looks great. But then when you actually go to implement it, you're like, oh, no, that's horrible. Why? Why would you do it that way?
And if we say it's true and we can't live consistently in those presuppositions, is it corresponding to reality?
It does not.
It does not. But here's another thing I want to bring up. How do we know from a philosophical and presuppositional standpoint that truth is that which corresponds to reality? And let me throw this out there. We know that because that statement is once again a self-evident truth. It's axiomatic. In order to refute saying that truth is what corresponds to reality, you have to say that that statement does not correspond to your reality.
Yep. Now, did we talk about it last?
But my point is to deny it is to prove it.
Yep. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think we talked about this before on one of the podcasts. Our podcast and our talks kind of blurred together. But I'm reminded of the passage in Exodus where Moses is talking to God and he's being sent back to Egypt to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And he says to God, well, who should I say is sending me? And God says to him, tell him I am sent you. Meaning, in that statement, I am, if you look at it in the Hebrew, means the self-evident one or self-existing one. Has no beginning, no end, no cause, has always been. And that's kind of the way with truth. Truth, when you boil it, a self-evident truth is something that it has to exist the way it does. Yeah,
and in philosophy, what they call that, once again, is a necessary being. It's necessary because it's got to be the ultimate cause of all things.
Right.
Because if it had a cause, and that cause would be the ultimate cause. Whenever you think of cause and effect, going back in time, this was caused by this, and this was caused by this was caused by this, and back, you can't go back infinitely. Eventually, you'll go back to an ultimate cause, and that ultimate cause itself is going to be infinite.
Yep.
And that's where God comes in, because Christianity, and this is something that is worth chewing on. Christianity is the only religion in the history of mankind that has an infinite God.
Yep. If you look at all the other ones, say the Greeks, for example. You know, their deities of Zeus and Hera and Apollo were all born from the Titan Kronos. Well, where did the Titan Kronos come from? That's never explained. If you look at the Norse mythologies, Odin and Thor and all of those beings were born at some point to various things that were just somehow there. Just there.
And then you had the Babylonian religion, like in the Numa Elish, the Babylonian creation story, where Marduk and Tiamat and everyone mingled their waters together, this pantheistic view of God, and created the world. But they were both finite. There's no mention of where they came from. There's no mention of anything. They're just, once again, there. The biblical God is the only one that is infinite and is said to be uncreated and eternal with no cause, because he is the uncaused cause, or the necessary being that it took to create everything. He's the infinite one. As I said, I am that I am, or I am who I am, whichever way you want to translate it. It's the idea behind it is I am the self-existent one.
Yep.
And that's what it comes down to. And because of that, without dragging this out any further, we just have to realize that all truth ultimately comes from God. And I've got a verse that I'm going to share on that note. Let me go ahead and share my screen, because we need to really see from Scripture how that is the case, because I think people get confused. Right here, it's in John 17:17. This was in Jesus Christ's high priestly prayer, right before his crucifixion. What he says here is, I'm going to start in verse 16. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. And he's talking about us. That's the context. He's talking about believers. Sanctify them by your truth. By your truth. Your word is truth. Is truth. It doesn't say it has truth. It doesn't say it's partially truth. Its very nature is truth. It is what it is. And then you could go to John 14:6, which we all know very well, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. See, it's his very nature. He is true. And these are the things that we have to realize, is that where God is infinite, that means he knows all things, actual and potential. He's all powerful. He's all wise. He's omnipresent, meaning everywhere present. He's infinite in every way. And he's got to be infinite because he cannot give or create what he does not possess. And that means everything that exists has its origin in God, which means if it's real, if it exists, and if it and all that, it comes from God. And since truth is that which corresponds to reality, as the old cliche says, all truth is God's truth. Yep. Even though we have to define that truth is that which corresponds to reality, and the reality that corresponds to is God and his nature himself. Yep. Agree with that statement?
Oh, I agree completely.
All right.
Now, there's really two kinds of truth, if that makes sense.
Yes.
But before we talk about that, we called truth objective. The opposite of objective is subjective. and subjective is to placing emphasis on one's own moods, attitudes, opinions, feelings, that sort of thing, also known as being arbitrary. Feelings do not dictate what the truth is. I want to backtrack real quick to that seventh definition: ideal or fundamental reality apart from and transcending perceived experience. That's a lot of big words in a row, isn't it?
Yep, and so break it down for them.
Okay, so you ever eat something really spicy?
Yeah.
You know, your mouth feels hot?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's say you eat some very minty gum. Your mouth seems to cool off, right?
Yeah.
In either of those cases, did the temperature inside your mouth actually change?
No.
No, it did not. So the reality is the temperature inside your mouth has not changed. Now you feel as though it has, but it hasn't. And so sometimes truth is different than what we are perceiving.
That's true, because if our thoughts and our observations do not correspond to reality, then it's false. Another example of that is if you get a glass of water and stick a ruler down in it, it looks like that ruler breaks because of light refraction.
Yep.
Is that ruler actually broken in that beaker of water?
No, it is not.
See, observation is different from reality.
Right.
I want to give. We don't want to get too far into that, because that's one of the false views of truth. But
right, I want to give one more example, and then we can move on. You live down there in the desert, Brian.
Yep.
You ever see a mirage?
We actually do.
Is that mirage really there?
Depends. Well, it depends on what type of mirage it is. Now, the mirage is because if it's a mirage out on the horizon, then you're seeing something below the horizon that's kind of like popping up over the horizon. So technically, it is. But one of the best mirages you all also get up there in Montana. It's when the heat is radiating off the road, and it looks like the road's wet.
Yep.
That's a mirage. It's not actually there.
Yep. So our observation does not correspond to reality. And that's kind of something that can blow your mind if you let it.
And let's not get in too deep into that, because like I said, this is one of the false views of truth that we're going to go over. But the point is truth has to be that which corresponds to reality. And I think where we're getting at is that we can be wrong.
We can be wrong. But there are, like we talked about just a moment ago, or I said, there's two types of truth. There's the physical truth. That's what we think of when we think of science, the physical world. You know, you talked about the ruler appearing to break in the beaker of water. That's the physical world.
Yes.
And most scientific things, you know, physical truth. And that's what most people think of when they say reality. Oh, physical things, you know, the rocks, the trees, the sky, my own body, you know, that's what I'm talking about. Well, there's another part to the world, and that is the metaphysical. Now, that's a fairly common word anymore, but I'm still going to define it. Metaphysical, when we say that, we're talking about the moral, spiritual, and philosophical truths. Things that you can't necessarily reach out and touch, but are still true.
And I would define it as an abstract truth.
Yeah,
something
abstract
like that isn't physical. It's real, but it isn't physical. And I think one of the best abstract truths that I think everyone believes in, unless if you're really went down and opened up Pandora's box, would be your consciousness. It's not material.
Yep.
It is, we don't even know what our consciousness really is scientifically. We know what it is biblically, but scientifically, the people with a anti-supernatural, anti-biblical presupposition have no idea what their consciousness is. They have no clue, because it's somehow produced by chemical reactions and nerve impulses in your brain, but they don't know how that works. They have no idea.
Right.
Because it's abstract. It's not something they can grasp and really study.
Yep.
But they accept it as true.
Yep. Yeah, you can't physically define it, but that doesn't mean it isn't true.
Exactly.
So there are there's just basically those two categories of truth.
Exactly.
But I think that's everything, and now we get into the false views of truth, right?
Yes, so to review, I want to make sure everyone followed that, because we went through a lot of technical jargon, and let's just simplify it in a nutshell. What truth is that which corresponds to reality. It's got to be real. It's got to be actual. It's got to exist in some way. And there are a lot of people who deny this definition. And we're getting ready to get into those false views, those people who deny it. But we have to keep in mind that by denying it, they are using this definition in order to deny it. By denying it, they're saying, no, that is not right. That's not how I see it. That's not what I observe. That's not what I believe. That definition is not corresponding to my reality. That is what they're saying. So by denying it, they are using the very thing to deny. It would be likened to me saying, I don't believe in air. Well, what's the problem with that? I need air to speak. All sound is different in air pressure. So I have to use air in order to say that I don't believe in air. It's the same principle. So it refutes itself.
It really does.
So keep that in mind, that truth is what corresponds to reality. It's a self-evident truth. Anyone who thinks it through will see that that has to be the definition.
Right.
So let's get into some of those false views then. The first one is what we call, and don't be scared of this, it's what we call relativism.
Yep.
And I call it the relativism/humanism view. And let me define what those terms are. Relativism states that there is no absolute truth. And what we mean by absolute truth is that there is no way of telling that something is absolutely true beyond a shadow of a doubt. No absolute truth. No infinite universal standard that says this or that is true.
Right.
That is what it is. And relativism comes from what we call humanism. Humanism is the philosophical stance that all truth can be derived from reason alone, from human reason alone, without any outside influence.
Right.
Pretty much that we are our own God and we can determine what's true and false subjectively just based on reason alone.
Yeah, that's humanism. The definition I have written down for relativism is the theory that truths are relative and may vary according to the individual, place, or time.
So subjective.
Yeah, totally subjective. It means what's true 5 minutes ago doesn't necessarily make it true now.
That's exactly what that definition means, yes.
Now, yeah, let's start to pick that apart.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind when we pick that apart is the very definition of there is no absolute truth. Well, David, tell me, is there no absolute, just say that, there is no absolute truth.
There is no absolute truth.
Are you absolutely sure?
Well, I guess I am.
Then you're stating the absolute.
Exactly.
You see, but here's the thing with that. people might try to get around that by saying, well, the only absolute truth is the fact that there is no absolute truth. And I'm like, okay. And you'd have to ask them on what basis. And they say, well, it's a self-evident truth. It's just something I observe. Oh, so now it's not self-evident because you're saying it corresponds to your reality. See, you're using your reason. You're getting an outside influence to try to defend that. It's corresponding to your reality now. Your reality is false, but you're still changing your definition of truth by saying that. See where I'm coming from?
I do.
So they're refuting themselves once again. It doesn't work that way.
And I think the basis of both our arguments is this. There is not a my truth or your truth. There is simply the truth.
Yes, and the reason for that is this. People go down the relativism trail because they know that if they can get rid of the absolute being God, that they're not accountable to anything. So they like to say there is no absolute truth at all. Because if they go down the second route and say the only absolute truth is that there is the statement there is no absolute truth, they're admitting that there's at least one absolute. And the problem with that is if there's one, how come there's not two? You're opening the door for there to be more. And if you open the door for there to be more, then they're admitting that maybe I'm wrong.
Well, and the idea of relative truth, if one person says there is absolute truth, another person says there's no absolute truth. Well, the person that says the person that says there's no absolute truth is saying, well, both can be true. Well, that's what you call a diametrically opposed idea. They cannot coexist. For example, if you and I look at a car, or let's say you and I look at the color of a wall, and I say, well, that's kind of a bluish wall, and you say, well, that's a green wall. The reality is it's probably a bluish green colored wall, where neither of us are wrong, but neither of us said something that is the complete opposite of the other. But if one person is saying absolute truth exists, and the other person is saying absolute truth does not exist, only one of those things can correspond to reality.
And what's funny about that is if I walk up to a relativist and say absolute truth does not exist, and they say that I'm wrong, then they're refuting their own position because according to their position, I have to be equally right with them.
Yep.
Because that's my truth. And who are you to say that my truth is wrong? After all, it's all relative.
Yeah. A true relativist cannot ever look at you and say that you are wrong.
And do you see right away where we already failed one of the tests? A true relativist cannot live consistently in their worldview.
Right.
If there is no right or wrong, true or false, go up to a relativist, pull out a knife, stab them in the gut, and steal their wallet. And when they tell you that that was wrong, tell them there is no right and wrong. There is no true or false. And then go on your merry way.
Yeah. Now, don't actually do that.
But the point is they'll really quick be backtracking and adhering to a moral absolute, which is a total Christian thing.
Oh yeah. In fact, I had this same discussion when I was a teenager. I went to, I'm hesitant to even call it a church. But the pastor of that church, we're going through what's called confirmation. It's a Lutheran thing. Yeah. It's like catechism for Catholics. But anyway, in that he said, well, he espoused relativism, that, if you believed something was true, that made it true. And I looked at him and said, okay, what about these people that believe it's okay for them to go out and murder a bunch of people? They haven't done anything wrong, according to themselves, because they don't see it as wrong. However, society very clearly says, hey, that's wrong. Now, where does that higher morality come from? God.
And who is God in that situation? Here's your absolute.
Exactly. Now,
see, one of the biggest things of absolute is, as we said, it comes down to authority. People don't want to be held accountable for their action. Absolute truth is usually centered around morals more than anything else. It's a way to escape. It's a way to escape ethics and morals.
Yes, exactly. I was about to go into that point exactly. Relativism is usually moral, is used to destroy an argument of morality. Well, if you destroy morality too much, you get pure anarchy. Now, yes, there are some people that espouse pure anarchy, but I don't think they would like it if they got it.
True.
Now, there are, unfortunately, some scientists who even extend relativism to physical truths. I remember reading an article about a paper that some scientists had published, and I think it's got to be almost a decade ago. But these scientists proposed the idea that the universe changes based on our perception of it. And so the universe itself and the laws thereof are not constant, and they're always going to conform to what we think they are. I was like, whoa. Now, like I said, I was once on a career path to be either an aerospace engineer or a theoretical astrophysicist. Those things deal in absolutes. And to me, saying, well, the universe just changes based on a perception of it, that's not just sloppy science. That's not even junk science. That's just straight up nonsense.
Yeah. It is. So the point is relativism essentially comes from humanism. It is our desire to make our own truth, to escape the accountability of God. It goes back to what we talked about the last 2 weeks, Romans 1:18 through 32. That's essentially what it is. It is escaping moral responsibility for our sin. It is trying to escape the guilt of our sin, and it's trying to pacify the conviction and the misery that we have due to our own wickedness. That is essentially what relativism is about. But we cannot function in relativism because we're made in the image of God, and we think his thoughts after him. We have his morals written on our conscience, his law written on our conscience, and we know in our heart of hearts that there is an absolute authority and an absolute truth that not only dictates what's right and wrong, true or false, real and fake, but dictates every single area of our existence. We know that. Now, we can try to suppress it, but when we suppress it far enough and we realize that we can't live consistently in it, what do we revert back to?
Yep.
That which corresponds to reality.
Exactly.
We can't escape it. We cannot escape it.
We cannot. In fact, could you bring up Proverbs 12:15 real quick?
Yeah, let me share my screen here.
Now, once again, I'm reading from the King James. He probably has the New King James up. They're both accurate.
All right, right here. Let me move down here. There you go.
Now, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. So we can all do our own thing, but if we are ignoring reality, we're ignoring people trying to tell us, hey, that's not so great, we are a fool. And that's basically what relativism does. It says, well, I am the one that gets to decide right and wrong and good and bad, and we're a fool if we do that.
Absolutely. But do you think we covered?
Of course, you've also got, in the beginning of Proverbs, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God.
There's the humanistic mindset. Get rid of God, get rid of the absolute, and you become your own authority.
Okay, now, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I'm going to talk about Darwin for a second, if that's all right.
And then after this, I think we need to move on to the next view.
Yep, to the next one. Now, when Darwin first espoused his theories of evolution and things like that, he was laughed at by the scientific community. His cousin was helping Darwin to basically promote his theories. Think of his cousin as being in marketing. He's trying to convince people to go with his cousin's theories. And he was interviewed one time, and you'll have to forgive me, I couldn't find the exact quote, but this is a paraphrase of it. And he was asked, he said, well, why do you think that people are going to get on board with this? And he says, well, my cousin's theories removed the need for God. And isn't that what we all want, to be our own boss? If we can get rid of God, then we can each do whatever we want. And that's what we as human beings want to do.
More or less. So you see the agenda out there.
Exactly. But yeah, I think we should probably go on. I believe the next one we were going to talk about was pragmatism, yes?
Yes, pragmatism. And in layman's terms, what pragmatism simply is, and let me get you back up on the screen here. What pragmatism is, in layman's terms, would be more or less, truth is whatever works or benefits you.
Right. The dictionary definition is the doctrine that ideas have value only in terms of their practical consequences, and that results are the sole test of the validity or truth of one's beliefs.
Yep. So we got to ask ourselves, does this even touch on absolute truth, or does it just more or less speak of making life easier?
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of relativism taken to the next level. Really, that's how I think of it.
Yeah. It's like there is no truth, so let's just do whatever makes our life easier and whatever is for the common good of people.
Right. And I would consider pragmatism to be very selfish. Oftentimes it places your own needs and wants above those of everybody else, because the pragmatic view is, okay, I want to do this thing. What is the best way for me to get what I want?
Yeah, and pragmatism is, I'm going to go ahead and pull up another verse here, because this goes with both pragmatism and relativism, as they're very closely related. And it was Judges 21:25. This was at the end of the days of the judges, and in the Bible, the days of the judges was just this time of flux between Moses and the time of the kings. And it was pretty much a democratic society, majority rule pretty much. But here was the ruling ideology. It was a pragmatic relativism, really. In those days, there was no king in Israel, aka no absolute authority in the human sense of the term. And what did people do? Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, there's a relativistic statement. Everything was subjective, but at the same time, that subjective was everything. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The idea is they were pragmatically doing what they felt would bring the best good to themselves and society.
Right.
That was a pragmatic statement, David.
Exactly. Now, some of the people who are the most pragmatic that I have ever encountered, I encountered when I used to work at a prison. I used to work at a prison, the next town over. I spent nearly 2 years working there, and I worked directly with the inmates. I was a kitchen supervisor, and the inmates were the ones that cooked the food and served the food and all that. I just basically oversaw things. Well, the prevailing idea of an inmate is, I'm only sorry that I got caught. Basically saying it's not wrong to steal, to lie, to cheat if you don't get caught. And there are so many people, sadly, nowadays that hold to that mindset that, if there are no negative consequences on me, then it's okay. It doesn't matter if there are negative consequences on somebody else. I can lie to you. It doesn't matter what happens to you as long as nothing bad happens to me.
Yeah, and that is the selfish end of pragmatism, but there is also a selfless extreme of pragmatism, which usually takes form in the government. And that's when the government does what is best for the common good of the people, regardless of if it's right or wrong in God's eyes. And I guess what's best for the majority of the people, or it's still selfish though, because sometimes it's what's best for a certain niche or a certain group of people that they want to win over. That's really what it comes down to. It's still selfish in its motive.
Oh, very so. Very so.
So pretty much what pragmatism, I guess, what we could say, David, is it's whatever appeals to, well, this kind of goes into the next one. It kind of what appeals to the flesh, but we'll save that definition for the next false view because, the next false view is just pragmatism on steroids. But,
Now, there are two other things I'd like to mention really quick. Other views on pragmatism that are very prevalent in our culture today. Now, there are a lot of people that think it's okay to sell their body to make money. That's the whole point of a strip joint. People taking off their clothes and getting paid for it. I don't even know how many websites there are that have people taking their clothes off and doing lewd acts in exchange for money. And there's this thought process nowadays that, that's fine. That's a valid career choice. There is nothing wrong with what they're doing because they're getting paid. Well, that completely throws out what God says about such things. And I don't want to go too deep into this,
Yep, and I'm going to add to that because you just held it, because it completely ignores what God says, which once again is you are getting rid of a what? Of an absolute.
Absolute moral
That's
truth.
why
Yeah.
this is an offshoot of relativism.
Yep. And another one that I feel compelled to mention, but I don't want to dwell on. There are lots of people who think it's okay to kill a baby in the womb simply because that baby is going to be an inconvenience to the woman bearing it.
It's what works for their situation.
It's a very selfish thing. Now, you and I have discussed it, and there are nuances to it that we don't need to get into here and now.
Absolutely.
But the overall view that, it's no big deal to kill an unborn child totally violates God's law. You know? So, yeah.
And let me go to another extreme there with pragmatism. One thing that we have to understand with pragmatism is, once again, like I said, it deals primarily with morals, ethics and morals, just like relativism does. It's an offshoot of relativism, so we have to keep that in mind. So whenever we're pragmatic, we essentially do whatever works to carry out or to pacify our moral guilt, right? Or to pacify some sort of evil that we're doing. And a great example of that would have been the concentration camps in Nazi Germany.
Yep.
See, the Nazis had convinced everyone that that Jews and gypsies and blacks and homosexuals were subhuman. Completely false. Completely false. But they had convinced everybody that. And in order to, and see, that philosophy was, number one, a relative philosophy that worked to pacify their guilt, into thinking that. But what were the concentration camps? It further pacified them, because then they could destroy those people in a pragmatic way, because the concentration camps worked. See, it linked up with their false view of morality and their false view of truth. And it it was a way that worked to carry out that false view of truth to its furthest extent.
Right. I would also like to add that among those that the Nazis killed were not just the people you mentioned, but also the elderly, the infirm, and the mentally and physically disabled.
Which is really relevant today, because you have the whole euthanasia idea. I mean, the communist euthanasia idea, when an elderly person gets too old to contribute to society and we have to pay for their medical bills, if you do not base your truth in what corresponds to the reality of God, those people are a burden on society now. So what works to alleviate that burden? Kill them.
Right. Now, most people find that.
But you see, if you have a relativistic mindset, who's to say you're wrong?
Yep.
Because there is no absolute guiding your ethics and your morals. It works. It solves a problem. But does that mean it's right? Does that mean it's true? Not at all. That's a great example.
Well said.
That's a great example of pragmatism and how, even though it works, doesn't mean it's right.
Yeah.
I think that we covered pragmatism pretty good.
Well, I want to go one step further. Not one step further, but mention something that's happening nowadays. I don't know if you've seen this in the news. The Chinese government is taking people, normally those are handicapped or injured or elderly or homeless or something like that, and harvesting them for their organs.
See, it solves a problem.
Solves a problem, but
it's right.
Exactly. I mean, yes, it's, and so the international organ market is flooded with these people that the Chinese government and some of the people that are their organs are being harvested are maybe political opponents that are saying, well, the communists are wrong. I mean, if you have a government that has the power to label someone as okay to kill,
Yeah, David, that's hard.
that is, but it's scary. It's scary.
But let's go ahead and move this and go on to pragmatism on steroids, because this is kind of what fuels not only pragmatism, but also relativism. And this is called hedonism. And what hedonism essentially states is that if it feels good, it's got to be true. So just do it. Do whatever feels good.
Right.
It's the follow your heart mentality.
Yep. And the dictionary definition of hedonism is the doctrine that pleasure or happiness is the highest good.
Yeah.
Now, we've got to ask a question, whose pleasure or whose happiness? Normally, it's the individual. So if it were me, whatever felt good for me, it's okay for me to do.
But what happens if that negatively affected another person? I mean, it might feel great for a pedophile to go out and rape 10 children. It fulfills his lust. But what does that do to the children?
Exactly.
Do you see? I mean, viewers, guys, with the pragmatism, hedonism, relativism, do you see where it might look good on paper, but in practice, you can't live this way? Society can't function this way?
Yeah.
You can't live consistently in these worldviews.
Right. Now, I will say this, hedonism, historically speaking, was first espoused or talked about by a student of Socrates way back when. And today, and even then, hedonism is often practiced by people who, number one, do not believe in God, in any gods, or if they do, they're, weirdos like the Greek gods or something. Number two, usually don't believe in an afterlife. They believe hedonism is okay because there is only the here and the now. That's the only thing that matters. And the only thing that matters to me, the only thing that can give me any fulfillment is to get as much personal satisfaction as possible while I'm alive.
So it's an escape from the Christian worldview once again. It is based in something that does not correspond to reality.
Yep.
See, it's the presupposition that, well, and it's actually the presupposition that fuels the next false view, but it's a presupposition that nature and the physical world is all there is.
Yep.
Do you see, David, how all of these false views are linked together? They all come from the same mind.
Yep.
They all come from a demonic entity that has infiltrated the human mind, because they're all linked up together.
Oh yeah, they stack on each other like blocks.
I mean, it's all from the same rationale. You can't separate them.
Now, let's, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there is I won't call it a prevailing viewpoint among some Christians today, but it's widely accepted enough that we need to talk about it here.
Yeah, and we talked about this at length yesterday, and I didn't even know this theologian held to this, which was kind of shocking to me because I read this guy. I've never come across it. Maybe because I just don't read this part of doctrine that he espouses this stuff in. but
Yeah.
it's something that John Piper believes in. And David knows a lot more about this than I do. I'll give you the name of this false doctrine and a brief little definition of it, but I'm going to let him really dig in because he's the one who's explained it and researched it. It's called Christian hedonism. And what Christian hedonism pretty much is that it's worshiping God through your own pleasure. And no, that does not mean that's sinful pleasure. Piper does not promote that. Not at all. It's not sinful, sensual pleasure, anything that's outlined in the Bible. No sins of the Bible. It's more of a pleasure that I gain my joy from the physical world and not from God, and somehow that action is a worship of God. So it's an enjoyment of the physical world removed from the worship of God. Pretty much, David?
Yeah, it's kind of weird. He often flip-flops.
He double
he's trying to.
He double talks a lot.
Yeah, he flip-flops a lot when he's talking about it. In some quotes, he's saying it's the physical euphoria that you get during worship. And if you're not feeling that physical euphoria during worship, you're not actually worshiping. Now, that is a very feelings-based and experience-based Christianity, and that's not at all what you find in the Bible. But let me read a few things real quick. Christian hedonism it's still hedonism. I mean, why in the world you would choose to call something Christian hedonism, I think, is beyond me, because hedonism has such negative connotations. And the main goal is the same as regular hedonism, that of joy, good feelings, and positive emotions. Now, they derive their positive emotions from different sources, like you said. John Piper is not saying, go sleep around, go do drugs. He's saying, no, those things are sinful and you shouldn't do them.
Yeah, and I don't want to demean Piper, because Piper is actually a very moral and godly man.
Right. Yeah, I don't want to give the wrong impression, and I hope I don't. So he's not saying go out and go sin.
Yeah.
On that we can agree. On that thing we can agree. But it makes the goal of worship to be your own joy instead of the praising of God. When you read quotes, when you read him talking about it, he makes it seem that the purpose of worship is so that I can experience joy. Now,
does he
what's
mean
wrong
that?
with that?
Well, and we got to ask ourselves, and this is if he doesn't mean that, that's on him, because he didn't clarify what he means, because a surface reading of his writings certainly imply that's what he believes.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I've read through this. I haven't read everything he's ever written, but I read a good portion of it, and I looked at that and said, well, no, that can't, no, that does not line up with a correct Christian worldview. Now,
but you ask what is wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that statement is simply this: biblically speaking, joy and peace and happiness and everything is found solely in God. And in fact, both joy and peace are fruits of the Spirit, according to Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 through 23. And because of that, it's by walking in the Spirit that we can enjoy the peace and the love and the joy of God. See, our joy is a feeling that comes directly from our fellowship and our dying to ourselves and our following of God. It's a supernatural thing. And we just can't gain joy from a material object. There is a difference between being happy and being joyful. And I think that he is confusing the two. Because
Right.
you can be happy, you can derive happiness from physical objects for a short time, but it's not lasting and it's not the same as joy.
Right. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say it. Service to God is not always pleasurable, and the Bible often talks about trials and tribulations, and flat says that they're not going to be pleasant.
True.
Now, some examples of this. Joseph in the Old Testament, when he was wrongfully thrown in prison. That's not joyful. That's not
misery.
That's misery. Now, he still had he kept his faith, but were there times where he was just utterly miserable? Oh, I'm 100% sure that he was. But does that mean he wasn't worshiping God properly? No. Look,
I think of Paul of Silas being locked up in prison, singing hymns unto the Lord with joy.
Yep, that was one of the examples I was going to give. Daniel in the lion's den. He was scared. Ashak, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the furnace. They told Nebuchadnezzar, even if you kill us, we're not going to do what you want. And they were thrown into a furnace so hot that it killed the people that threw them into the furnace. Were they experiencing joy? No, not immediately. I'm sure they experienced joy when they realized that they weren't burning to death.
And even more importantly, I bet you they experienced joy when they saw the Son of Man in the fire with them.
Exactly.
Where did the joy come from? Did it come from their situation, or did it come from their fellowship with God?
And now here's one other example of just abjective, complete misery. And that is Jesus on the cross.
Yeah.
He experienced no joy during that entire process. He was miserable physically, emotionally, spiritually. He said, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Those are not the words of a man who is experiencing joy.
No.
Now, I want to read an excerpt from Dr. Piper. I'm trying to give the man his due. Dr. Piper himself wrote a web article in which he identifies the chase after pleasure as being of higher priority than any other motive or human endeavor. In the web article, and this is a direct quote from the web article, Brothers Consider Christian Hedonism, he said, and here's where the quote starts, by Christian hedonism, I mean that pursuing the highest good will always result in our happiness. But all Christians believe this. Christian hedonism says more, namely that we should pursue happiness with all our might. Now that emphasis is mine. The desire to be happy is a proper motive for every good deed, and if you abandon pursuit of your own joy, you cannot please God.
That is not.
Wow.
No.
Now, let's bring up some verses to refute this, because this is a man who is a well-known Bible scholar, and in other areas, he is completely spot on with what the Bible teaches, but in this area, he is 100% wrong.
And I want to clarify something. He's not spot on in every area. I do not want to
No,
give
I said in other areas.
Yeah, I mean, for Piper, guys, I would not recommend him for anything beyond Bible, theology, and Christ.
Yeah.
I mean, any other doctrine, angelology, Holy Spirit, demonology, salvation, he has some major problems going on. So be careful.
Right. And I'm going to go ahead and add this. This is my personal opinion. It does not reflect the view of Brian, his church, or anybody but myself. I, for one, find that when it comes to people like John Piper, there are other people whose books and teachings you can read that will give you the same or better view of those same doctrines.
And I would not argue that. I read Piper because I like his explanations on a few doctrines, but there is so much I disagree with him on that, especially if you're a new believer, I wouldn't get too close to him. Just saying. But go ahead, David.
Could you bring up Luke 8:14 real quick?
Yep, let me go ahead and get that going. Luke 8:14. I got it here somewhere. At least I thought. Yep, I can pull it up. Okay.
Now, this is the tail end of the parable of the one who sows seeds. It talks about some of those seeds fell on good ground, some of them fell on hard, stony ground, and some of them fell amongst the thorns. Now, verse 14. And that which fell among the thorns are they, when they have heard, go forth and are shocked with the cares and riches and pleasures, choked with the cares and riches and pleasures of this life, and bring no fruit to perfection. The emphasis being mine. I'm added the emphasis. But doesn't that sound like Christian hedonism?
It does, because right now the word pleasures there is more sensual sin, but riches and cares is an anxiety.
Yep.
That's the word for anxiety, but riches are just that. That's the material. Riches is the word that you want to focus on there, because anxieties and pleasures are sinful in and of themselves. They are. But riches isn't necessarily sinful in and of itself. It is the heart attitude by which we approach riches. And in this context, it's showing that if you're choked with riches, if you focus on riches and riches alone, you have not been brought to perfection, or as the New King James says, maturity. You have not been brought to spiritual maturity. You are immature in your faith because you're focusing on material things, the earthly things, more than the spiritual.
Right. And I will say this, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole more than just this brief sentence. There are those out there that teach that if you are poor, you are not pleasing God and you are in some sort of sin. And that is an equally false thought process, because they are caring about riches rather than righteousness.
I'm going to pull up a verse right here, because look at Philippians 4:11. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, which means to lack, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That is not Christian hedonism.
No, it's not. Now, if you could bring up Luke 9:23, please.
Okay.
Now, these are, as you can see, red usually denotes the words of Christ. And I'm just going to read off the screen. Then he said to them all, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. That does not sound like Christian hedonism, because what did Piper say? If you abandon pursuit of your own joy, you cannot please God. What is Jesus saying right here?
You cannot follow him if you don't deny yourself. It's denying the worldly pleasures and being content in the blessings of God.
Right. And another verse, Matthew 10:38. And here is, I think, the most blunt way to refute hedonism in general, and this also applies to Christian hedonism. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me.
That's it.
And then let's go on to the next verse. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it.
It's not about our will and our happiness. It's about the glory of God.
Exactly. And that is something where, unfortunately, hedonism is infiltrating the church. And that's why I felt the need to go off of, I didn't, well, go off is probably the wrong term, but to speak about this, because it's just, it sounds good on the surface, but if you really look into it, it's like, no, that's not what the Bible teaches at all.
In fact, what the Bible teaches is this. Hedonism is derived from the suppression of truth in Romans 1. Like, look at what verse 24 in Romans 1 says. After we suppress the truth of God and unrighteousness, what does God do? Therefore, God also gave them up to the uncleanness and the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchange the truth of God for a lie and worship and serve the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Now, this is not Christian hedonism, of course, because we've already said that John Piper would never fall into homosexuality like this verse is talking about. But this is speaking of hedonism outside of the Christian church, that it is actually a result of the suppression of God and God giving you over to your pleasures. So if a church takes hedonism and applies it to Christian doctrine, I think you can make a case that it too is derived from idolatry.
Oh, definitely. Oh, now it brings to mind the verse, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound?
And KJV says, God forbid. In the Greek, it says, may it never, ever be. It's a double negative, which means don't you even stink and think about it.
Right. There's so many.
Because in the Greek, because I know in English a double negative nullifies. In the Greek, it strengthens and emphasizes. So it's more like, don't you even think about doing it.
Right. And along those lines, in the Bible, when it says holy, 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 that's like so holy you can't even understand it.
So whenever he says never ever, he's just putting a lot of emphasis on don't do it.
Yeah, don't do it. Now there are so many churches nowadays that are teaching, well, it's okay because we're forgiven of all sin and past, present, and future, and therefore everything's okay. That is not at all what the Bible teaches.
No, we're to deny ourselves. But David, let's go ahead and move that. So we know what hedonism is. Hedonism is. It is just relativism run amok. It's to the point that you've given up all reason and you're just doing what feels good. That's more or less what it is. So now let's go on to empiricism.
Yep.
Empiricism is more or less that truth can only be attained through observation. And
right.
that,
and this is
not only observation, but more specifically, observation of the natural world. Only those things that can be sensed with your five senses are real.
Right. I consider empiricism kind of the other side of the coin when it comes to relativism, if that makes any sense.
I do. I get you.
Now let me read a couple definitions here real quick. Empiricism, according to the dictionary, number one, empirical method or practice. Okay. Now, in a philosophical context, and this is what we're talking about mainly today, although it also works in a scientific context.
It does.
The doctrine that all knowledge is derived from experience. Now, on the surface, in a moment. 3, reliance on observation and experiment as the basis for knowledge. Okay, that seems to be good too. Now, I want to go over real quick what the word empirical means, because in the first definition it was empirical method. Well, what's empirical? 1, derived from or guided by experience or experiment. Okay, well, that seems to make sense. 2, depending on experience or observation alone, without using scientific method or theory. And it goes on to say, especially in medicine. We're not really going to get into medicine much tonight, but that's the definition. 3, provable or verifiable by experience or experiment. There's a lot to unpack there, but the first thing that came to my mind is sometimes, and we talked about this earlier with the definition 7 of truth, sometimes our observation does not correspond to reality.
That's exactly it. See, in order for empiricism to be true, you'd have to be omniscient and omnipresent. You'd have to know everything, and you'd have to be able to observe everything. And we're not. We're finite, and we're in a bubble. And it's because of that fact that some people actually lean towards relativism. They realize that. They realize that since we're finite, we can't know everything, that you can't know anything. They take it to the extreme.
Yep.
Which is dangerous. But before we go any further with empiricism, I want to just show the self-destructing nature of empiricism. If it's true that empiricism, that only things that can be seen are empirical, there's a few philosophical problems with that. First of all, empiricism, by its nature, is a philosophy. Can you see, taste, touch, hear, or smell a philosophy?
Maybe if you're on some super high strength drugs.
Maybe, but by its very definition, you can't even prove that the philosophy itself is true.
Right.
Because it is arbitrarily believed outside of its own system.
Yep.
So that right there is, boom, gone. But number two, where you don't know everything, I guess if they stay consistent to their philosophy, nothing exists. Literally nothing exists until we discover it.
Yep.
Do you see how it doesn't work in the real world, guys? It's not consistent. You can't stay consistent in this worldview. You have to go back to what we said. Truth is what corresponds to reality.
Well, exactly.
And that's why empiricism, there's some element of truth to it, because how can you tell if something corresponds to reality? By the empirical method. You got to observe it, right? Yep. But empiricism is not saying that you cannot determine truth by observation. What we believe you can get truth by observation. What we don't believe is that you can arrive to absolute truth by observation. Because you got to be infinite and omniscient in order to arrive to absolute truth. See, absolute truth is like everything else in the world. And if you haven't watched the last 2 weeks of our podcast on inerrancy of Scripture, go back and watch them, because we clarify this. But all things are ultimately taken by faith. So once again, since all things are taken by faith, there are some things that, we just got to trust in, and empiricism can only take you so far. Right.
Now, the empirical method, when applied scientifically, is valid. Observation, the testing of scientific principles, those things are valid, and we're not trying to say they aren't. However, if you base solely off empiricism, solely off empirical data, you will arrive to some incorrect assumptions. For example, let's say, Brian, that you and I are both in the candy aisle at the grocery store.
Okay.
And I'm standing there trying to figure out which candy bar to buy. I see you pick up a candy bar. And you leave the candy aisle. Okay. Nothing odd about that. Few moments, maybe a little bit later, I leave the candy aisle. As I leave the candy aisle, I see you walking out the front door of the store. Okay?
Okay.
Did I see you go through the checkout line?
No.
I have no proof that you went through the checkout line. If I am solely going off empirical data, I have no reason to believe that you went through the checkout line. I have no reason to believe that you paid for that candy bar.
Other than the faith that I'm a decent person. My integrity.
Exactly.
That's the only thing you have.
I
There's
have
no
to go.
empirical data to prove it.
Yep. No empirical data.
And that's once again, like I said, you can't arrive to an absolute truth by empirical data alone. You have to have some sort of faith. Period.
Mm-hmm.
Science does it constantly. Religion does it constantly. Even Christianity does it. And we do. We have faith in our empirical observations of this book. We do. We examine this book against the reality of the world, and we try to see, does it align to reality? Is it trustworthy? And it is. So therefore, and like I said, watch the last two videos, the last two episodes, and you'll see where we're coming from. But it is. And that's why we believe it, because the empirical evidence gives us a reason to trust it. But
Yep.
there's still a faith element involved in it.
Right.
Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. So you can't escape that.
Exactly.
But you can't take it to such an extreme that you say that you can't know anything and become a relativist.
Exactly.
Hence the name of this podcast. We're trying to teach you how to be a balanced Christian.
Exactly. And now empiricism usually deals more with the physical truths than the moral truths. That's kind of why I think of it as the other side of the coin from relativism.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of things that we know are true that we can't prove. We have no idea why they're true. For example, according to what we know scientifically, atoms should fly apart, especially the nucleus of an atom, because it's a bunch of positively packed, subatomic particles that are repelling each other and should just fly apart. But they don't. And we know for a fact they don't because we observe that they don't. However, we don't know. We don't know why that atom stays in one unit as we observe it to do. We refer to some of the forces in the subatomic structure as the strong force and the weak force. And those two forces have never been really explained. We know that they exist, but we don't know why. We can't say why it works. There are some theories here and there that maybe kind of sort of explain things, but not really.
And not only that, we don't even know what gravity is.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many theories out there, like, the space-time fabric and all that stuff. But it hasn't really been observed. It's just a mathematical formula on a piece of paper.
Right.
It's still theory. We don't know what it is.
And so many of these theories are impossible to test. And I kind of talked about this a little bit before when I talked about my history with theoretical astrophysics. So much of that is just straight up
Conjecture.
conjecture. It's a theory built upon a theory, built upon a theory, and it's this precarious stack of theories that if one of them is wrong, the whole thing comes tumbling down, and most of them are physically impossible to test anyway.
That's it. So the point is empiricism, because I want to speed up as we're all because we're over. Empiricism simply states this. Empiricism cannot arrive at the absolute truth, no matter how hard you try, because we're finite. And absolute, by its very nature, is infinite. So a finite mind cannot arrive to an absolute truth, no matter how hard you try, because you cannot examine an infinite amount of data. There's always going to be something outside of your bubble that you've never seen, that you've never observed, that could completely nullify everything you believe. And because of that, empirical data don't work. Make sense?
Right. Well, it works to a certain degree. Empirical data works to a certain degree.
Not to arrive, the context, though, is not to arrive to an absolute.
Okay, I agree entirely.
We can do it to find truth, but not absolute truth.
Right.
There's a difference between that.
I agree. In fact, and like all things, we try to back it up with scripture. Can you bring up Proverbs 1:7 real quick?
Absolutely. And by the way, before Proverbs 1:7, I'm going to show this verse. It shows the biblical refutation to empiricism. It's Hebrews 11:3. By faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things that are seen were not made by the things which are visible.
Yep.
That refutes empiricism. But what's yours?
Proverbs 1:7. Now, empiricism states that experience, all knowledge is derived from experience and observation. But what do we see in verse 7 of Proverbs 1 here? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction.
Exactly, because where we are not infinite, if we have reason to believe that infinite God wrote the Bible, then we can go to the revelation of that infinite God and receive the wisdom and the knowledge that we need to arrive to an absolute. Because we need to go to an infinite mind, because we are not infinite.
Exactly. And to help you kind of picture that, we've all, when you think of a scientist, sometimes you think of those people making a rat run through a maze, right?
Yeah.
Well, the rat can only see the walls in front of him. He doesn't know how that maze is laid out. He can only see what's directly in front of him. He knows where he's been, but he doesn't know what's around the next corner. However, the scientists are standing above the maze, looking down. They can see the whole maze all at once. They know exactly where the rat should be going. They know what's around the next corner. They know how many turns it's going to take for that rat to get to where they want him to go, because they are above it. They have a higher perspective than that rat does. And just like those scientists have a higher perspective than that rat, so God has an infinitely higher perspective than us mere mortals.
Exactly, because it's not that just he can observe everything we do. He knows what we think. He knows how we choose. He designed our very reasoning and choice processes. Yep. He knows it so infinitely that he is omniscient. He has all knowledge, and that's where we go for the absolute truth. He has an absolute knowledge of the universe.
Exactly.
Which it don't matter how much empirical data we have. He has more.
Yep.
Infinitely more. So to think that in our finite knowledge, we can say, hey, a trustworthy book like this has never been proven wrong, So I know better than what's written in this book. That's a very obtuse statement.
And very abstract one.
It is. So that's something we have to think. So, but let's move on from empiricism. Well, before we move on from empiricism, I'm going to add one thing about naturalism. Naturalism is derived from empiricism because more or less the reason is because we observe the natural world. So in order for empiricism to work, it has to be built on the assumption that nature is all that exists. So once again, it's an arbitrary assumption that cannot be proven, that is an attempt to get rid of moral accountability to God.
Yep.
And once again, if you go back about 2 or 3 weeks, I think it was, what was it? It was 3 weeks ago when we went over, 2 weeks ago, when we went over the evidences for the existence of God. It was in part 1 of biblical inerrancy. Go back and watch that. I think it will really help you with the existence of God and how there's no way empiricism and naturalism could be true. No way. No way at all. But let's go and try to wrap this up. The next one's appeal to expert authority. And the experts are elitist. People who, it's self-proclaimed authority and a self-proclaimed expert. That's more or less what this is. It is, what this says is just because a group of experts, whether it be doctors, scientists, lawyers, politicians, college professors, whoever it is, says something's true, it must be true because, hey, they're smarter than me, they know more than me, and they can't make mistakes.
Right.
That is what that belief says. They can arrive at absolute truth. Don't question them.
Right. But as we talked about at the very beginning, when we were defining truth and what it means to be objective, we flat stated that no matter how hard we try, we always have some sort of bias. We always have some sort of presupposition that we're going into things with. And so this mindset that the experts can't be wrong is just ridiculous. Now, I want to say this before we go too much further. I am not saying that you should completely discount anything that a trained scientist says or a doctor or any of those people. I'm not saying to throw out everything that they say. That's not at all what we are saying. What we are saying is they are not infallible. Always double check what they say to see if it actually matches up to truth, aka reality.
Exactly. Because, and that's really the crux of the whole argument, dude, because in reality, experts, all it takes is just one dude that says, hey, I figured this out, I'm an expert in it. And if all the other experts follow suit and the majority of experts believe it, then we're expected to follow it blindly as it's true. But let's say, for instance, and I know this is controversial, and I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole at all. But Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, is a cardiologist, and he is a virologist. Many people don't know that. He's a medical doctor.
Yes, he is.
And he flat out said that half of the science that Dr. Fauci has proclaimed with this COVID outbreak is a bunch of nonsense.
Right.
You have one expert refuting another expert, and Rand Paul is not the only expert that refutes this stuff. Which expert or which group of experts are right?
Yep. Well, we talked about last week something similar. The gentleman, and I forget his name, but the gentleman who created the Weather Channel.
Mm-hmm.
He was the mind behind the very concept of the Weather Channel. A trained climatologist, is his viewpoint is that man-made climate change on the large scale is total junk science and doesn't exist.
Yep. And Michael Ord, which is a retired meteorologist that now works with Answers in Genesis, he has his PhD in atmospheric science from Montana State up in Bozeman. And he says,
I did not know that.
He says the same thing.
Right. Now, both of these people are experts. However, they are saying something different to what other experts are saying. Once again, who are we supposed to believe? They're all experts.
And by the way, those aren't the only two who disagree with climate change. There is a huge list of meteorologists who disagree with it.
Oh, there are. But here's the thing. A lot of experts go out of their way to discredit other experts simply so they won't be seen as wrong. Now, we talked about this last week when we went over that doctrinal statement from that progressive church.
Yes.
And they're talking about, Christians shouldn't disagree with science. Like, okay, well, what is science? How is it handled? Yada, yada, yada. The idea that you and I, as people that don't have a college degree in these areas, are completely incapable of making and forming an informed opinion about these matters is junk. Now, I don't know all the facts, but I am smart enough to do some research on my own and to make an informed opinion. And sometimes that opinion is going to differ with a quote unquote expert, and I'm not necessarily wrong. Now, I need to double check myself. If I'm not an authority in a matter, I need to study. I need to, but I am capable of doing. Okay, is what this person's saying actually match up to reality?
And that's it. It goes back to that. Does it correspond to reality? Because just because they're an expert doesn't mean anything.
Right. Now, I would like to go over real briefly 1 Timothy 6, 3 through 5. Now, so the question remains, if you find this person who is claiming to be an expert, and the things they have said has been shown to be false, what are we supposed to do? Well, if any man teach otherwise and consent not to wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to the doctrine which is according to godliness, he is proud, knowing nothing, but doting about questions and strifes of words, whereof cometh envy, strife, railings, evil surmisings, perverse disputings of men of corrupt minds, and destitute of truth, supposing that gain is godliness. From such withdraw thyself.
And of course, the context of this is false doctrine, but doctrine is truth, and but doctrine is the truth of God, and anything else that corresponds to reality is the truth of God because it comes from God. So it still applies if someone is creating strife and division and arguments and contention. We are to withdraw ourselves.
Well, we are to withdraw ourselves if these individuals are not teaching truth. Sometimes
exactly.
It is divisive to speak the truth.
Yeah, and that's the context. As I said, it was false doctrine.
Right. Yeah. But and sometimes I think it also applies to the physical sciences. If there is a scientist or a doctor or whoever that is trying to convince you of something that just flat isn't true, stop listening to them. And people say, well, they're an expert and you're not. Yeah, but what they're saying isn't true. And if what they're saying isn't true, why should I bother listening to them?
But how do you know it's not true? And that's something that we have to do. Does it correspond to reality or not? You are smart enough to see if it corresponds to reality. But not only that, the biggest thing is, and you got to train yourself to do this, always think of their presuppositions. How do they know? What's their definition? What's their authority? Where are they getting their information? I mean, question their authority, question their expert. You vet them, pick them apart. I mean, try the spirits to see if they're of God. I mean, that's really what it comes down to.
Right. And we're never going to have all the answers because we're not perfect. I can't know everything about every science. And I'm not saying that anyone can. I am saying, however, that it's possible for us to look at something and to work it through ourselves and to say, you know what? Yeah, what that person says aligns to reality as far as I can tell. So yeah, they're correct. However, this person over here,
And you bring up an excellent point, because one of the best ways you can do that is to seek out other experts.
Yep.
And see,
that's why,
do they have a different viewpoint, and listen to them and see which one aligns to reality better. Because if you've got a group of experts that believe different things, then you have a way to test their presuppositions, and if it aligns to reality or not. You can try to find out who's true, who's telling the truth, who's right, who's wrong, who's on the right track, and who's completely off in the left field.
Right. Now, this doesn't just apply to the physical truths, but moral truths as well. For example, we talked about Dr. Piper and some of the things that he does and says that aren't necessarily correct. There are lots of individuals, experts, that disagree with his teachings in these areas. And so we're left, okay, which expert do we believe?
And, I hate using the word expert when it comes to a theologian. I know what you meant, because none of us are expert in the Bible. And I know what you meant, because, I consider myself a theologian. I do. I'm constantly in the Word. I have my degree is in biblical studies, for crying out loud. It's in hermeneutics. But believe me, I'm far from an expert.
Right.
So we got to be careful to not go down that trail, of course.
Right.
But let's go into the final group, the final false view, which is very closely related to expert, and that's the appeal to majority. This is just when the majority of people in society say something's true. And it's usually based off of experts, of course, so it's very closely related, but there are common knowledge in the world today that might not be true. Period. Just misconceptions that are held across the board.
Right.
Well,
I want to give a few examples. Now, what we're basically saying is, just because a bunch of people say something's true doesn't necessarily make it true. You've got to double check it for yourself. Now, for example,
I'll give one example before you do. It goes back to Nazi Germany. It goes back to Nazi Germany. Because remember, a majority does not mean majority in the world. It could be a majority in a household, majority in a nation, majority in a county, whatever. A majority within a group of people. I've got two examples. Let's say you have a large family, 10 people, and you're the only Christian in the family. Everyone else is an unbeliever. Does that automatically make you wrong?
It does not.
It doesn't. Nazi Germany. The majority of people believed everything that we talked about earlier, that Jews and homosexuals and everything were subhuman. Does that make them right?
It does not.
Because there is a higher authority than the majority. The absolute is what dictates what's right and wrong, not the majority.
Right. And in the in the whole Nazi Germany thing, you brought this out last night in our conversation, when they were during the Nuremberg trials. The Nazis' defense was saying, well, we didn't break any laws of Germany. We didn't break any German laws. How can you therefore try us with anything? And what was the response, Brian?
It was a Supreme Court justice from America. He looked at the Nazi officer and said, we can try you because there is a law that transcends Nazi law. That is an absolute above Nazi law that says that you are in the wrong. And that is what we're going to try you by.
Right. And what was that absolute law?
Well, that's tricky because the absolute law is a law of God.
Yep.
But unfortunately, upon further research, the Supreme Court justice actually went with the appeal to majority.
Yeah.
World majority.
Right. But that,
which was sad. It worked in that situation because
it did.
Case, but did that alone prove them wrong?
Well,
no.
But think of it this way.
God and his moral character is what proves it wrong.
Right. And think of it this way. Nearly every society in the world has a few basic tenets that we can all agree on. Theft is wrong. Murder is wrong.
True.
Rape is wrong.
Because it's written on our conscience. We went over that earlier whenever I said, hey, with a relativist, go and stab them and take their wallet and see if they think it's still okay.
Right. But where do these individuals get the
law written on their heart?
Exactly. It's not because, murder isn't wrong because everyone says it's wrong. Murder is wrong because God says it's wrong.
Now, evolutionists will say that it is a tribal instinct that evolved over time to preserve the species and all that, and blah, 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 whatever. But here's the thing, guys. How do they know? Arbitrary, conjecture, theory. Can't prove it. It's based on their reason and their rationale alone. The Bible says it's the law of God written on man's heart. The Bible's trustworthy. Watch the last 2 episodes, you'll see why. And we have a solid rock to stand on. Ours isn't conjecture.
Exactly. Now, I want to go over a couple things real quick.
Okay.
A couple instances where, historically speaking, the majority was wrong about scientific fact.
Absolutely. Go for it.
Did you know? Now, I consider myself an amateur medieval historian.
Okay, you said that last week, but go for it, bro.
During medieval times, it was a commonly held belief that rotting hay became mice. Like, it physically became mice.
Yep, spontaneous generation.
Yep. Now, today, we realize that that is completely false. It's simply mice like to be in rotten hay. But that's an example in history where just because the majority of people believed a certain thing doesn't mean it's true. Another example.
And David, that actually ties back to empiricism, is they were observing something that wasn't quite interpreted correctly.
Exactly. They observed something, but they did not understand the reality of the situation.
Exactly.
And that's how the majority can be wrong, by a incorrect interpretation of a situation. Another one, people once thought the Earth was the center of the universe. Now, we now know that not only is the Earth not the center of the universe, it's not the center of the galaxy, it's not even the center of our solar system. But in the past, it was a very commonly held belief that the Earth was the center of everything. Now, we know now scientifically that's wrong, but once again, the majority of people believed something that was later proved to be false.
Exactly. And
Now,
we've got about 3 minutes, so let's try to wrap this up.
I want to bring up Romans 3:4 real quick.
Romans 3:4.
And just as a reminder, we've used this verse before. But when dealing with truth, when dealing with all those things,
Okay, it's up there. You're ready to roll.
Yeah. Certainly not. Indeed, let God be true, but every man a liar. Now, once again, just with any truth claim that we can talk about, if it disagrees with what God has stated in his word, it is wrong. Period. End of story. Conversation over.
And that's it. But David, what it really comes down to is this. This episode was meant to be watched in conjunction with the prior two on inerrancy of Scripture. It's kind of piggybacking off of those. So if you did not watch the prior 2 episodes on inerrancy and authority of Scripture, please do, because this will even make more sense, because we're appealing back to the Bible as our ultimate standard, and we need to remember that, But really, what this comes down to is this. Truth is objective. It's what corresponds to reality. It must be observed empirically. But you cannot arrive to absolute truth by any of that. Absolute truth is taken by faith, but that faith has to be grounded in something trustworthy. And that's where Scripture comes in, and that's what we talked about the last 2 weeks. It's by believing in that trustworthy truth that we arrive to absolute truth. And we know it's absolute because out of all of the faith systems in the world, you can look throughout history. And this is what this Balanced Christian podcast is all about, becoming a Balanced Christian podcast. We're wanting to show you that Christianity is the only faith system in the history of the world that is so consistent that we don't have to leave our presuppositions in order to live. We can walk in our worldview consistently, never wavering from what we believe. Everyone else, on the other hand, cannot live consistently in their standard of truth and actually have to borrow from our worldview in order to make their world make sense. And that's how we know it's true. It's an axiom, brother.
Well, I want to add one more thing. There's a lot of talk today about things that aren't allowed to be questioned. The Bible says that truth doesn't mind being put on trial because it will simply be found to be true.
Absolutely.
It encourages questioning. It encourages people saying, okay, now is it really like that? And when you go through it, well, oh yeah, it is. Wow, it really is true. Okay. It encourages that critical thinking and, lining it all out and seeing, okay, does this really match up like it says it does? The Bible itself encourages that mindset.
It does. And lies don't like to be questioned.
Exactly.
Because if it's a lie and you have a correct view of truth, and you start looking at that lie and you realize, oh, this does not correspond to reality. Then you're like, oh man, there's evidence that proves this wrong. It's not consistent. It contradicts itself. This isn't trustworthy. This isn't something I can have faith in. Because remember, biblical faith is not a blind faith. Biblical faith is a trust. It's trusting in something that is objective and trustworthy.
Yep. In another place in Scripture, God says, come, let us reason together.
And that Hebrew word for reason is the Hebrew word for debate.
Yep.
Is sit down and have a dignified discussion on how do we know something's true.
Exactly.
And that's a beautiful thing. But David, thank you so much. We had a 2-hour episode, and I think it's great. And I'm just going to keep it as a 2-hour episode. We're not even going to split it up into a 2-parter. We're just going to post the whole thing, brother.
You sure?
I'm absolutely sure. If people
right.
want to split it up into 2, they can. They can. They can stop halfway through and pick it up next day.
Fair enough.
It's not like you're watching it live.
Yeah, true.
Now, if this is a live podcast, it might be a little different, but you know. But yeah, man, I appreciate you, and I think that we covered that in a pretty decent and thorough way. And I'll definitely have you back next week. We'll figure out what we talk about. But in essence, guys, and I'll go ahead and round up the episode with David online here, so we can just close it out. I hope you enjoyed David and his insights. I think he added to the discussion. And David, I think you can attest to this. If anyone out there doesn't know Jesus Christ as their Savior, they can contact either one of us, right?
Amen, brother.
Absolutely. If they wanted to talk to you about something, I could give them your email, couldn't I?
Yes. Give them the my Hotmail account.
Okay, I would be able to do that because they might want to talk to you about some stuff too. So, but other than that, guys, come back next week. But until then, we here at Restoring Love Baptist Church and the Becoming a Balanced Christian podcast will pray for you constantly. And we just ask that God will strengthen your faith. And if you're a skeptic, will open your eyes and bring you to faith. We're always here. Read the credits at the end of the video here and contact us if you need anything. But have a great day. And if you're saved, have a great day and God bless. And if you're not, we just hope that God will give you the grace needed to get through your day and give you the peace needed to live more consistently. But guys, the only way that, if you're a skeptic, the only way that you can really do that, to have the joy, the peace, and the tranquility in life and the consistency in life is to convert to Christianity. And we just ask that you consider it. Contact us if you need it. But until next week, we will be praying for you. And guys, thank you for watching. And thank you, David.
Anytime, brother. God bless.
You take care, man.